Good morning. Good morning and welcome. I'm Mary Miller. I'm the director of the Getty Research Institute, and I'm not going to do another formal welcome because this morning we're going to be trying to give you a little bit of different information about our next 2 days that now remain. I will just say that as I thought about everything I learned last night, I had this feeling of being in the kind of the wave of 16th century knowledge and how much more there is to learn today. I'd like to call to the podium Kim Richter, who is Senior Research Specialist in the Getty Research Institute and who has done so much, along with Manuel Aguilar-Moreno, who you will also hear from in just a minute, who's done so much to make this weekend possible. Kim?
Hola, buenos dias, piali, good morning. Welcome to the second day of our symposium, 1519, the arrival of strangers, indigenous art and voices, following the Spanish conquest of Mesoamerica. So for those of you who weren't here yesterday, I'm gonna just give you a brief introduction to the Florentine Codex. I'm gonna advance this here, since this is the critical manuscript around which that inspired much of what we've been doing here over the past few days. So yesterday, the talks focused on the Florentine Codex, an encyclopedic manuscript produced collaboratively by Franciscan friar Bernardino de Sahagún and a team of indigenous authors and artists, and it was created in 16th century Mexico City. Renowned for its bilingual presentation of pre-Hispanic indigenous culture and the Spanish conquest of the Aztec Empire, the Codex's 12 books contain a primary Nahuatl text, a Spanish interpretation of the Nahuatl text by Sahagún, and thousands of illustrations painted by Nahuatl artists. Scholars regard the Codex, modeled after ancient Roman and medieval encyclopedias, as the most reliable source of information about Mesoamerican culture. And as we saw yesterday, it provides the most extensive surviving account of the Spanish conquest written in the Nahuatl language. And as we saw with Manuel and his very detailed biography of this manuscript, it was completed in 1577. Then the manuscript was sent to Europe, where it was acquired by the Medici. I'm simplifying this whole story a lot. And it is today housed in the Biblioteca Medicea Laurentiana in Florence, Italy, and they have been very gracious, generous partners with us. They allowed us to digitize the manuscript and have been very supportive of our endeavors. The manuscript is so important that it was incorporated into UNESCO's Memory of the World Register in 2015. And Balthasar, I think you were involved with that initiative, right? Today's presentations will move beyond the Mexica Nahuatl perspective documented in this unique and invaluable manuscript and examine other Nahuatl perspectives on the Spanish conquest to underscore that this historical event was not a monolithic experience for all indigenous groups of Mexico. For example, we will hear about the motivations of Nahuatl and other ethnic groups for joining the Spaniards in their war against the Mexica capital, Tenochtitlan, that brought down the Aztec Empire. And because this research from yesterday and today grows out of a major collaborative initiative here at the Research Institute, supported by the Getty Trust, I thought I would tell you a little bit more about it, since I keep bringing it up. So it's consumed me for several years now, so I speak of it very fondly. Our initiative has three main outcomes. Number one, a scholarly publication on the Codices Book 12, which documents the Nahuatl Mexica perspective of the Spanish conquest, and something that we are preliminarily calling the Digital Florentine Codex, which will give scholars and the public for the first time full digital access to this illuminated manuscript and its transcriptions and translations, including via text and image search. And what I'm showing you here is not a final design by any means. This is a wireframe where we're just trying to figure out what this potentially might look like. This will also feature Eduardo de la Cruz, Eastern Huastecan Nahuatl summaries of Book 12 that he mentioned yesterday, as well as the recordings of him reading the Nahuatl text. So you can listen to the whole thing in Nahuatl. And then the third outcome is our 4,000 entries to the Getty vocabularies in English, Spanish, Classical Nahuatl, and contemporary Eastern Huastecan Nahuatl, drawn from the codices' unique linguistic information. We will use those vocabularies to present standardized keywords related to art, architecture, material culture, and people as metadata to tag the images in the codex and make them searchable. This means you could, for example, call up all images representing Malintzin or Moctezuma with one easy search. The initiative aims to give global access to this manuscript and disseminate knowledge about its cultural significance. We have a big team working on realizing these ambitious goals and are collaborating with outside scholars and institutions. And I'm just quickly going to flash these names to acknowledge everybody's dedicated past and future work on this endeavor. Thank you to the whole team. You are inspiring me on a daily basis. Now, before I turn it over to Raquel and Manuel, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the students of the Cal State LA Art History Society who have worked tirelessly on organizing the symposium and who you will be seeing throughout the day because they're introducing the speakers. So when I read your name, please stand up and give a quick wave. So Raquel, we will start with you and maybe you can come up here. Raquel Rojas, who is our outgoing president, and she will say a few words to you in a minute. Then we have Erica Garcia. She's the incoming president. We have Vanessa Bravo. April Ramos, who was, she was my intern a few summers ago, so I have a special. Alegría Garcia. Gabriel Avila. Sara Salcido. Lorraine Delcano. And some may not be here, but you'll see them tomorrow. Sarah Brown, also not here. Rocio Castro, mañana, okay. Michelle Morataya, mañana también. And Dash Gomez, also tomorrow. So you guys are awesome.
Hi, everybody. My name is Raquel, and I'm excited for today. Thank you all for coming to our second day. Yesterday was pretty incredible, and we had a lot to learn. And today I hope that we gain a lot of knowledge and learn a lot from our speakers, and they learn from us as well. So thank you all for coming today. I hope you enjoy the program. And I'm going to turn it over to Profe. Come on up.
Good morning, everyone. After we have heard of the marvels that happened yesterday in the event, with the great talks, presentations, and the discussion in the front, at the end, the roundtable we had yesterday, and I think as Janet Peterson put it, and other people of you realized, it was like a weaving. Yesterday was like a weaving. We had different lectures that when you put them together, you produce like a full textile weaving, all making sense and having consistency. So it was a very, very beautiful day. We expect another very beautiful day with the new other presentations. As you will notice, our program is organized, and Kim mentioned some of these. The first day was focused completely in the Florentine Codex, especially Book 12. Today, it will be opening a little bit to Central Mexico, other versions of the conquest. And tomorrow, it opens even more, and we will talk from California, what happened in California, to all the way to the Maya. No? So we will cover basically different regions of Mesoamerica. So everything is organized together as a huge weaving in which we discuss, we reflect about this topic that is presented here. And it's a symposium that joins the homenaje nacional that is being made in Mexico for Miguel León-Portilla. And now our symposium becomes the first posthumous symposium for him, for Miguel León-Portilla, with his passing a few days ago, and that has created a big pain, not only in Mexico, but in the world, for the great trajectory of this scholar. For us, as I mentioned yesterday, but I see new people coming today, it's a great honor for us, Cal State LA. For those of you that don't know me, I am Manuel Aguilar-Moreno, and I am speaking on behalf of Cal State LA. It is a great honor that we had the opportunity to co-organize this symposium with the Getty. No? So we thank the generosity and great levels of coordination that we could have together, and as a result is producing this event. Especially I want to thank Mary Miller, Kim Richter, and Jen de la Fuente, with whom we had meetings, and we were trying to take care of all the different aspects of this event. And also I want to thank all the people of the staff of the Getty that helped to put together, for example, the auditorium and other audiovisual resources, etc. Kim and Raquel already mentioned, but I also feel very proud of our Art History Society students who are the operational part, together with some of the staff of the Getty, to put together this event here in the workings. I want to thank also the sponsors that besides the Getty Research Institute itself and the Seaver Foundation that were already mentioned by Kim yesterday. I want also to remember Cal State LA, Art History Society, Associated Students, Inc., the Secretaría de Relaciones Exteriores de México, so basically the General Consulate of Mexico, Delta Aeromexico, Tortillería La Patria, Planet Green Environmental, Far Horizons, the Arby Foundation, and UNAM Los Angeles. As you can see, behind an event like this, we have the participation of many entities, and all together produce these results, because, as you know, events of this type imply a lot of effort in many parts and many sides. Then this 2019 symposium becomes a memorial and a tribute to that great scholar and eminent scholar, Miguel León-Portilla. He is recognized internationally as one of the most prominent specialists in the language and cultures of pre-Columbian civilizations, more specifically the Aztecs. And also he made the effort and connection to unite the world of the indigenous peoples of the past with the indigenous peoples of today. That is a very challenging initiative, because he was the director of the Instituto Nacional e Interamericano Indigenista, no? the National and Inter-American Indigenous Institute in the 60s. With the publication of La Visión de los Vencidos, translated to English as Broken Spears, León-Portilla proposed a new form of historiography whose purpose was to show the story from the point of view of the conquered, rather than the traditional version of the conquerors. So I want to join Kim and Raquel in welcoming you all to what continues to be a spectacular and emotional symposium. Muchas gracias.
Our next speaker is Kevin Terraciano. He is Professor of History and Dr. E. Bradford Burns Chair in Latin American Studies at the University of California, Los Angeles. He is currently Director of the UCLA Latin American Institute. Professor Terraciano specializes in Latin American history, especially Mexico, and the indigenous cultures and languages of Mesoamerica. He is the author of The Mixtecs of Colonial Oaxaca. He founded the Nahuatl program at UCLA in 2015 and is co-founder of the Florentine Codex initiative at the Getty Research Institute. Please join me in welcoming Kevin Terraciano to present Nahua Memories of the War in Mexico Tenochtitlan and Tlatelolco.
Good morning, everyone. Pleasure to be here. I would like to thank Mary Miller and Kim Richter and the incredible GRI staff, including Jennifer de la Fuente, who received my PowerPoint this morning, for all this good work for this meeting of ours, and Manuel Aguilar and the Cal State Art History Society for making this possible. I'd like to thank the audience as well for being here. Today, I'd like to examine briefly 5 indigenous texts that contradict the meta-narrative of the war in Mexico Tenochtitlan that conquistadors and official chroniclers of the Indies developed over the course of centuries. The imperial narrative that many European and North American historians have revisited and repeated over and over again until recent times. When I think about this paper, I realize that this is really a long footnote to Visión de los Vencidos, the fabulous work that Miguel León-Portilla did more than 50 years ago. And so I am simply following his lead in talking about these sources, many of which are covered in the work. Now, what I'm interested in is beyond telling their sides of the story about the war that the Spaniards called a conquista, some of these Nahua writers and artists seem to have realized seem to have been aware of the Spanish narratives and contradicted those narratives, and without always referring to the specific sources that they contradicted. These texts were little known and underappreciated until the second half of the 20th century. And the writers and artists who preserved the knowledge of the past with these texts have changed how we understand the early period of contact and colonization that affected all indigenous peoples of the Americas. I will begin with Book 12 of the Florentine Codex, the most incredible, lengthiest, most detailed account of the encounter in war. But I'd also like to talk about these other 4 texts to give us some context of how the Florentine account is corroborated by other Nahuatl language accounts written all within 100 years of the war. All of them come from Mexico City and surroundings. Many of them are from Tlatelolco, Tenochtitlan, the island in the middle of the lake. Here's an image of the map of the Basin of Mexico when the Spaniards arrived. And you can see here the island in the middle of the lake where Tenochtitlan and Tlatelolco were. So let's begin with the most extensive indigenous account of the war, Book 12. A group of Nahua elders and scholars wrote the text in their own language in 1555, 34 years after the war ended. They worked under the auspices of a Franciscan friar, Bernardino de Sahagún, at the Colegio de Santa Cruz, the first European college founded in the Americas in the 1530s. The Nahua men would have remembered much of what they saw and relied on the local oral tradition in and around Mexico City to fill in what they had not seen. In his prologue to Book 12, Sahagún affirmed that, quote, "the men who wrote this account were alive at the time of the conquest," and that the account came from the very Indians who took part in the conquest. Indeed, some of the men who contributed to Book 12 were old enough to have fought the Spaniards as warriors in 1520-21. 3 years earlier, in 1552, the personal chaplain of Hernán Cortés, Francisco López de Gómara, published the first history of the event after Cortés's Cartas de Relación, his letters to the king. And Cortés's letters were printed in Latin, Spanish, and other languages beginning in the 1520s. The conqueror's son paid Gómara 500 ducats to write the history. And Gómara's account essentially reiterates Cortés's version of events, defends him against accusations of treason and greed, and glorifies him as a great hero. So the Nahua writers of Book 12 were writing down their history 3 years after Gómara's book. And in fact, there are several suggestive parallel accounts in Gómara and Book 12. For example, Gómara's account features 6 omens that presaged the arrival of the Spaniards and the war, just as Book 12 of the Florentine begins with 8 omens. In comparing Nahua and Spanish histories, I'll focus on 2 pivotal events in the narrative: the Toshkat massacre and the imprisonment and death of Moctezuma. Basically, Spanish accounts written in the 16th century explain the massacre of unarmed men and women who were dancing and singing in the ceremonial plaza of Tenochtitlan in 2 ways. The Spaniards were so disgusted by the pagan celebration that they went off and killed people. Or the celebration was a pretext to ambush the Spaniards. By this time, Moctezuma had been placed under house arrest and was killed soon after the massacre. The Spanish justification for taking the Mexica leader hostage is that they did it to protect themselves. And after the Toshkat massacre, Cortés ordered Moctezuma to go out on a rooftop to try to pacify his people, and rebels pelted him with stones and arrows. He died from his wounds a few days later. This rebellion, according to most Spanish historians, killed Moctezuma and led to total war. It's likely that the Nahua scholars and elders who worked with Sahagún were aware of the accounts of Cortés and Gómara and the general imperial version that portrayed the war as a divine intervention and a just war waged to punish the rebels who had killed Moctezuma, the ruler who had allegedly submitted to Cortés and pledged his allegiance to the crown. We know that the team of bilingual and sometimes trilingual Nahua scholars who worked with Sahagún consulted European books in the Colegio de Santa Cruz library in Tlatelolco, and that they used models in European books for some of the more than 2,000 images that they produced. At the very least, they would have heard Spanish versions of the war which circulated in Mexico City and were recalled every year on the feast day of San Hipólito, August 13th, the day that Cuauhtémoc surrendered to Cortés. Each year, Spaniards in the city commemorated their great victory by parading the royal standard from the viceregal palace to the church of San Hipólito, a ceremony that made multiple references to the war and even reenacted events from the period. In Book 12, the meeting between Moctezuma and Cortés is peaceful, but is fraught with tension and fear. Cortés receives a royal welcome and flower necklaces as a symbol of peace, but he and his men are fully armed. Thereafter, the Spaniards immediately seize Moctezuma, according to Book 12, force him under house arrest, and loot his palace. They destroy sacred objects and melt down the gold. Here's an image of that destruction and the melting down of the gold. Pedro de Alvarado commands the Mexica to celebrate a feast dedicated to their patron deity, Huitzilopochtli. And then the Spaniards massacre unarmed men and women in Tenochtitlan's ceremonial precinct. The Nahua authors remember this unprovoked act as the cause of the war. The massacre was so central to the narrative that it's depicted in chapter 1, even though the event is not described until chapter 21. It was an act of premeditated mass murder that belied any Spanish notion of a just war. Sahagún decided not to translate the detailed Nahuatl description of the feast and all but a few lines of the text that describes the massacre in detail. Instead, that part of Book 12 is all images on the Spanish translation side. Now, Book 12 describes the ceremony in detail, and there's nothing really repugnant about it. Women make an image of the deity with amaranth seed dough. There is much dancing, drumming, and singing. The ceremony involves no sacrifices. Then suddenly, without provocation, the Spaniards attack the gathering, strike the drummers with their swords, block people from escaping the plaza, and kill as many men and women as possible. The Nahuatl text remembers how blood ran like water, how the ground became slippery with blood. At that point, Moctezuma is placed in full chains. After the massacre, when war was declared, when the Spaniards were besieged, Cortés commanded Moctezuma to call off the attack from the roof of his palace. When people throw stones and arrows at them, the Nahuatl text states that they are protected and not injured, contradicting Spanish claims that the rebels mortally wounded Moctezuma. In the next chapter, Spaniards toss the corpses of Moctezuma and Itzcuautzin, the ruler of Tlatelolco, into the lake. By affirming that Moctezuma and Itzcuautzin had not been injured by stones or arrows, and by showing Spaniards dumping their bodies into the lake, the Nahua writer and artist implicates Spaniards in the murders. If they were not free enough to declare that the Spaniards under Cortés's command assassinated their leaders, the Nahua authors insisted that the leaders were not killed or even injured by their own people, but that they died at the hands of their captors. The resulting war leads to death and disease graphically illustrated by the Nahua authors. Here are people removing bodies from the battlefield, a real grisly sight, and incinerating their corpses, and then, of course, the onset of smallpox and disease. In many Spanish histories and paintings of the late 16th and 17th centuries, the massacre is downplayed or not mentioned at all. Right? And this is rather it refers to the alleged episode of rebellion as the cause of the war. It's a just war because by rebelling against Moctezuma, who had recognized the authority of the crown, represented by Cortés, the warriors also rebelled against the king, and this was an act of treason. So this becomes the central justification for the war, and it downplays or ignores the Toshkat massacre completely. And once war breaks out, heroic Mexica warriors fight to defend their homeland in Book 12. But their city is destroyed and the population decimated. When the leaders agree to surrender, the Spaniards take slaves and search high and low for gold, and Cortés is not satisfied with the spoils of his conquest. Book 12 comes to a very sad end. It contradicts the imperial Christian narrative in so many ways. That's Book 12. Let's talk about the Annals of Tlatelolco here. Done as early as the 1540s, confirms the general view of events in Book 12. In fact, the Annal says that when people were preparing to celebrate the Toshkat feast, the Spaniards were already executing people in public before the Toshkat massacre. There's one section that says, quote, when Tonatiuh, meaning Pedro de Alvarado, gave the order to celebrate the Toshkat feast, Moctezuma was already imprisoned, along with Itzcuautzin. At this time, they hanged a lord from Acolhuacan, Netzahualquentzin, at the wall near the water. The second who died was the ruler of Nautla, named Coalpopocatsin. They shot him with arrows. When they had shot him, he was burned while alive. So that violence was already occurring, according to the Annales de Tlatelolco, before the Toshkat massacre. And in reference to the massacre, the Annales says that when the Tenochca and Tlatelolca began to adorn Huitzilopochtli with his paper garments and feathers, they danced and they sang all day long. They were attacked on the second day of dancing and singing. First, the Spaniards attacked the drummers, the old men who beat the drums, lopping off their hands and heads. Then the Spaniards went off. Here's a quote here from the Annales. I will let you read that. What this quote suggests that many women and servants were killed when they attacked us, including people who were in charge of feeding the Spaniards' horses. The text goes on to say how the Spaniards treacherously killed us. Tech pollo micti is the word there. And the pollo is a word that really is evil in Nahuatl. Another quote. Moctezuma and Itzcuautzin were trying to hold the Spaniards back. They said, "What are you doing? These people are suffering. They don't have weapons. They are unarmed." Right? The questions go unanswered. The Annales refer tersely to the sudden deaths of Moctezuma and Itzcuautzin. These are unspeakable crimes, traumatic events in the text. After Cuauhtemoc and the other rulers surrendered, the authors recall how the Spaniards searched the women especially. They pulled down their skirts, went all over their bodies, in their mouths, their vaginas, in their hair. The implications of these searches really are a violence toward women, rape. When everyone returned to settle in Tlatelolco, the text tells us that they were relieved to know that the Spaniards had gone to Coyoacan, where they hanged rulers. Other rulers in Coyoacan were eaten by dogs, according to the text. The Spaniards went on to wage war in Michoacan, Oaxaca, Tehuantepec, Guatemala, Honduras, etc. The narrative breaks off suddenly. It is a grisly history. Moving on to the Codex Alban. Really an illustrated set of annals in the Nahuatl tradition, a history of the Mexica from the Aztec migration to Tenochtitlan through the arrival of the Spaniards up to 1605 Common Era. The text associates the arrival of Spaniards with the death of Moctezuma. A ruler's corpse, Moctezuma's, hovers over the Spanish ship itself. The text preserves an enduring memory of the Toshkat massacre. You see the corpse there of Moctezuma. The text preserves an enduring memory of the Toshkat massacre. It's a very simple image. A drummer stands in the ceremonial plaza of the Templo Mayor, which has been invaded by an armed Spaniard. There's no need to depict violence here. The image serves as a mnemonic device that recalls the tragedy. Everyone obviously remembered that moment, and so this image was all that was needed to bring it back like that. How about Fernando Alvarado Tetzazomoc in the Crónica Mexicayotl, written in 1609? Now, he's a fascinating writer, Tetzazomoc. He's the grandson of Moctezuma on his mother's side, Doña Francisca de Moctezuma, and a great-grandson of Axayacatl on his father's side, Don Diego de Alvarado Huanitzin. He served as governor of Tenochtitlan. He was a high-ranking indigenous noble who worked as an interpreter in the royal audiencia. He surely was familiar with the official story of how his grandfather was killed. And in his Crónica Mexicayotl, he writes in reference to the year 1520, the Spaniards just killed them. Very unequivocal about that. There's another Nahua writer, prolific historian, Don Antonio de San Anton Chimalpahin Cuauhtlehuanitzin. We will call him Chimalpahin. He was very skilled in the Nahua annals tradition, born in Chalco, but lived most of his adult life in Mexico City. He said in his Nahuatl writings that he sought to preserve the history of his people for future generations. He wrote one account, the Séptima Relación, around 1615. It's almost 100 years after the war. And like the Alban annals, Chimalpahin associates the arrival of Cortés with the seizure and death of Moctezuma. Chimalpahin then proceeded to address three subjects: all the prominent people who died of the smallpox outbreak in 1520, the Toshkat massacre, and the death of Moctezuma. Unlike some of the earlier narratives that only implied that the Spaniards had killed the ruler unjustly, Chimalpahin is much more direct, possibly because by this time the matter had become less controversial than it had been in the 1540s and 1550s. Also, he is writing for other Nahuas, not for a Spanish audience. And so Chimalpahin says very straightforwardly that the Spaniards killed Moctezuma. They strangled him before fleeing. Right? What's fascinating about, and then they also killed all these other rulers. What's fascinating about Chimalpahin is that he consulted a lot of Spanish sources for his diario in Mexico City. We know that. And he was clearly aware of López de Gómara's history because he copied it and he edited it in Spanish. And his Spanish language edits to Gómara's manuscript may be more restrained than his Nahuatl language treatment of the war in the Séptima Relación, in part because he did not want to change things that Gómara said. If anything, he added things here and there or qualified details. But there is ample evidence, nonetheless, that he found fault with Spanish accounts. And most importantly, his rewriting of Gómara's Historia shows that he was deeply familiar with the best-known conquest narrative of the 16th century. In reference to the Toshkat massacre, for example, he copied Gómara and then added his own comment, which I include here in underlined. It's easier to believe the latter rather than the rumor that the Mexica wanted to mutiny against the Christians. Now, what do these Nahua accounts have in common? All were written in Nahuatl, written for other Nahuas. There is little to no mention of Christianity in these texts, whereas Spanish and many mestizo histories refer constantly to Spaniards preaching and promoting images of the faith, condemning idolatries. There is none of that in these 5 texts. There are no direct references to the faith, Christ, Mary, the cross, priests. Ironically, perhaps even sarcastically, the Anales de Tlatelolco uses the term Christians in reference to Spaniards when they are searching people's bodies for gold, taking women and slaves, hanging people and sicking dogs on them. These narratives suggest that the notion of just war was absurd. Just war in this period refers to the presumed legal right of Christians to wage war against heathens who refused to accept their God and to enslave them. It was applied to Africans, Muslims, and Indians alike. But how was it a just war in Mexico? The Spaniards were received in peace, given a royal treatment, and then the bellicose Spaniards suddenly turned on their hosts, kidnapped their leaders, and killed many unarmed men and women. Today, we would call this terrorism. There was no requerimiento, no speech read out in advance of the attack, no warning, The real cause of the war was an unprovoked massacre. Not one of these works, all written within a century after the war, was published until the 20th century. The one exception is the Florentine Codex, published by Carlos Maria de Bustamante in 1829. And at that point, in 1829, Bustamante was already attacking the official Spanish version, right? But that publication reproduced only the Spanish, not the original Nahuatl. And we're now aware, more than ever, how the Spanish and Nahuatl texts of the Florentine Codex can be very different, especially in Book 12. None of these works are in Mexico today. They are in France, England, and Italy. All 5 Nahuatl texts have come to the attention of scholars only in recent decades. Finally, nearly all the Spanish accounts and those of the so-called Indian conquistadors, exemplified by the Lienzo of Tlaxcala and the related work of the mestizo Diego Muñoz de Camargo, are written to seek favor from the crown with claims of service and obedience, crafted to gain some advantage or relief in the colonial system. All the conquistadors, those who claim to have taken part in the war, or those whose ancestors took part in the war, aimed their arguments at the crown. Histories designed to promote the glory of the empire, especially those written by official chroniclers of the Indies, paid by the crown to write those histories, like Oviedo and Herrera y Tordesillas and Solis. They wrote predictable works that were commissioned by the crown. These writers advanced a thoroughly colonial discourse that dictated the contents and objectives of those works. In contrast, not one of the 5 Nahuatl texts that we have examined here today was written to procure any favor. These writings were not aimed at the king or colonial officials. Not only did they not seek favor, they ran the risk of disfavor. Many of their claims would have been considered subversive if they were ever read by Spanish officials. For this reason, I personally find these counter-narratives, these writings, to be more credible than many other accounts that entered the imperial archive. These narratives decenter European versions of these events with the potential to transform our understanding of this period. And that's why these texts are so important, because so many people go to Cortés and Bernal Díaz del Castillo and all of the other Spanish language accounts, rather than these to understand what happened. And again, Miguel León-Portilla, the great Don Miguel, was aware of this a long time ago and synthesized many of these accounts into his fabulous work, Visión de los Vencidos. Finally, I'd like to reflect on the fact that clearly the conquest is more than an event. It's a process, and one that continues. Only recently, President López Obrador of Mexico called on the King of Spain to apologize for the conquest. This was, a year ago. I was in Mexico at the time, in Oaxaca, actually, and many people said they thought it was a great idea, but how perhaps the Mexican government should apologize first, considering the state of indigenous peoples in Mexico, which reminds us of the fact that this is the conquest is in many ways a continuous process, and one that many would argue continues today. It is extremely relevant, and that's one of the reasons why the conquest remains so relevant. The war remains so relevant to people in Mexico today. That's all. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Lisa Sousa.
Lisa Sousa is a professor of history at Occidental College and an affiliated faculty of the Latina, Latino, and Latin American Studies program. She teaches courses on colonial and modern Latin American history, ethnohistory, and histories of women, gender, and sexuality. She is the author of The Woman Who Turned into a Jaguar and our other narrative of Native women in the archives of colonial Mexico. Please join me in welcoming Lisa Sousa to present When We Collapse, Nahua Views and the Consequences of Conquest.
Good morning. I also wanted to begin today by thanking Kim, Richter, Manuel, Aguilar, and Mary Miller for their intellectual leadership. Of course, the great GRI staff who has undoubtedly worked many, many hours to put this program together. I also wanted to give a shout out to the Digital Florentine Codex Initiative team. It's been a real pleasure working with everyone on the team over the last year. And of course, I wanted to thank the students, the incredible, inspiring students at Cal State LA in the Art History Society who have also clearly worked very hard to bring us together today to discuss this important text. In designating 2019 as the Year of Indigenous Languages, the United Nations recognize that languages play a crucial role in our daily lives. They are not only our first medium for communication, education, and social integration, but also are at the heart of each person's unique identity, cultural history, and memory. Like spoken language, contemporary spoken language, the Nahuatl language texts and images by Nahua noblemen of the Florentine Codex express the unique identity, cultural history, and memory of the Tlatelolco authors who produced the manuscript. In the prologue to Book 12, Sahagún acknowledged that Indigenous contributors to the narrative offer different perspectives and insights that are not included in Spanish chronicles. He affirmed that, quote, those who were conquered found out and gave account of many things that happened among them during the war, things that those who conquered them did not know. Not only did Nahuas provide unique content to the history, their stories, told in their own languages and images, reveal Nahua cultural concepts and attitudes concerning the war and its aftermath. In both written and pictorial texts, Nahuas emphasize the devastating realities of their collapse as they referred to the fall of the Mexica Empire, including unprecedented death and disease, the destruction of Mexico Tenochtitlan, pillaging of material culture, displacement of the population, famine and thirst, enslavement, and the loss of political autonomy. Using philological, rhetorical, and visual analysis of Indigenous sources, this paper examines how Nahuas conceived of the ramifications of defeat and revealed the lingering traumas of war. These Nahuatl language accounts provide important correctives to the triumphalist narratives of Spanish histories, which rarely acknowledge the dire consequences of the conquest for Indigenous peoples. Nahua intellectuals produced their works in the mid to late 16th century against the backdrop of rapid changes. As we have discussed, millions of Indigenous people succumbed to waves of epidemics, and Nahua leaders saw their political autonomy curtailed. Nahuas were burdened with increasing demands for tribute and labor for individual Spaniards, the church, and the crown. Thus, these accounts, written a generation or more after the conquest, reflect both social memories of the war and its aftermath and the Nahuas' contemporary concerns as they faced unprecedented challenges. Today, I will focus on four major themes that emerge in Indigenous accounts of the consequences of conquest: death, destruction, devastation, and displacement. While most European chronicles portray the conquerors as loyal servants of God and king and downplay the brutalities of war, Nahuatl accounts often paint the Spaniards as bellicose, ruthless, and unscrupulous. This is most dramatically developed in the Florentine Codex account of the Toshkat massacre, when Spaniards, temporarily under the command of Pedro de Alvarado, ambushed the Mexica in the divine courtyard as they celebrated the festivities for Huitzilopochtli. The Nahuatl historians remembered, the Spaniards went into the temple courtyard to kill people. Then they surrounded those who were dancing, going among the cylindrical drums. They struck a drummer's arms. Both of his hands were severed. Then they struck his neck. His head landed far away. Then they stabbed everyone with iron lances and struck them with iron swords. They stuck some in the belly and their entrails came spilling out. They split open the heads of some and they really cut their skulls to pieces. Their skulls were cut up into bits. The repetition of phrases, they struck, they stabbed, they stuck, they split, they cut, suggests multiple voices contributing to this haunting collective memory, and emphasizes the relentless attack, the repeated killing. The text has all of the immediacy of an eyewitness perspective of those who participated in the conquest. The accompanying illustrations portray the Spaniards using their swords to annihilate the Mexica. The images of body parts scattered across the ground reinforce the Nahuatl shock that the Spaniards' weapons could cut through and dismember people that is conveyed in the text. The many decapitated heads and severed limbs visually represent the repetition of the text. While many lost their lives in the fighting, Nahuatl accounts also discuss how many others suffered the ravages of epidemic diseases that had been introduced by the Europeans. As we discussed yesterday, and as Kevin brought up this morning, smallpox was particularly deadly. The Florentine Codex described the first outbreak, and the detailed account may have been informed by subsequent epidemics. Quote, large bumps spread on people. Some were entirely covered. They spread everywhere on the face, the head, the chest, etc. The disease brought great desolation. A great many died of it. An image in Book 12 showing a female healer, or tisi, tending to the men and women stricken by the first waves of the smallpox epidemics to sweep central Mexico enhances the vivid memory of widespread suffering. The artist conveyed the overwhelming dimension of the pestilence by showing a lone tisi outnumbered by 5 victims whose bodies are ravaged by pustules. Most of the smallpox victims lie motionless, but the speech scroll in front of one of the female patients suggests that she cries out in agony, depicting the statement in the text that, quote, when they made a motion, they called out loudly, unquote. The image evokes the sound of suffering and the painful social memory of the consequences of contact with Europeans. The death and dismemberment of the Nahuatl body is echoed in accounts of the destruction of their city. The Nahuatl authors witnessed the dramatic transformation of their island home as the twin Altepet of Tenochtitlan and Tlatelolco become the seat of the Spanish capital, and thousands of newcomers or strangers streamed into the city. New European-style buildings and churches were built on the ruins of temples and palaces, sometimes using the very stones of the buildings that had been demolished. The authors of Book 12 described how, as the Spaniards lay siege to the city from ships, they used cannons to blast through walls and demolish buildings. The canal system also suffered extensive damage. By filling in canals and widening the causeways, the Spaniards could more easily bring their horses into the city. The Mexica relied on a vast network of canoes to move provisions and people to and from the island, so disrupting the system gave the Spaniards further tactical advantage. The Mexica recalled that in order to fill in a small lake and cut off the settlements along the road to Tepeyac, the Spaniards' allies cast rubble into the lake. Quote, "They seemed to go jostling one another, some carrying stone, some wood pillars, door lintels, adobes, cornerstones, etc. They paint an image of many people coming and going, tearing apart buildings for materials and clogging the waterways." In addition to demolishing buildings and destroying vital infrastructure of the city, the Spaniards set fire to the temples that housed the deities. When the Spaniards burned the temple at Tlatelolco, the Nahuatl authors recalled that, quote, "The fire seemed to crackle and roar. And when they saw the temple burning, there was weeping, and people greeted one another tearfully." Whereas Sahagun's Spanish translation explains that the people, quote, "wept bitterly," unquote, because they took the burning temple as a bad omen, so suggesting this was superstition, the original Nahuatl clearly states that the people wept because, quote, "it was thought that plundering was to begin," unquote. Indeed, throughout Book 12, the Nahuatl authors document many cases of pillaging elite and common goods as part of the larger process of the destruction of Mexico Tenochtitlan and Tlatelolco. The text provides a detailed accounting of specific items that the Spaniards looted from Moctezuma's storehouse, including the quetzal feather head fan, the shields, the golden nose crescents, the golden armbands. They are aghast that the Spaniards dismantled these precious items. Quote, "Thereupon the gold on the shields and on all the devices was taken off. And when the gold had been detached, right away they set fire to, ignited all the different precious things. They all burned. And the Spaniards made the gold into bricks. And they took as much of the greenstone as pleased them. As to the rest of the greenstone, the Tlaxcalans, the Spaniards' allies, just snatched it up. And the Spaniards went everywhere, scratching about in the hiding places, storehouses, places of storage all around. They took everything they saw that pleased them. Still not content, the Spaniards ransacked Moctezuma's personal palace, where they seized all of his precious things. They took all of it. They appropriated it, assigned and apportioned it to themselves. And when they had taken off each and every piece of gold, when it had been detached, then they assembled all the precious feathers in the courtyard, in the middle of the courtyard. The text clearly expresses resentment against the Spaniards and their allies for looting and destroying precious goods, a treacherous act given that Moctezuma had welcomed them into the city and the Mexica had not shown hostility. The authors again rely on the Nahuatl rhetorical convention of repetition to emphasize the magnitude of loss and destruction. Gold pieces are taken off, detached, and the Spaniards set fire to, and ignite all the different precious things. They take, snatch up, scratch about, appropriate, assign, apportion the loot. Whereas Spanish histories refer in general terms to the destruction of idols, temples, and books, indigenous accounts express a vivid memory of specific items or precious things that were plundered. The Mexica are forced to watch as the highest forms of artisanship are dismantled. The gold is melted down and formed into bricks, and sacred materials are denigrated. Like Moctezuma, common people lost everything when they were forced to flee their homes. When the people of Soquipan abandoned their homes after the fighting intensified, the Spaniards' allies took the opportunity to pillage all of the belongings the people left behind. The Nahua authors of the Florentine Codex remembered they, the people of Soquipan, took nothing at all with them. They just left all their poor property in fear. They just scattered everything in haste. And our enemies went snatching up, taking whatever they came upon. Whether from nobles or commoners, the authors commented that goods had been taken unjustly from them during and immediately after the war. Nahua authors emphasized that years of warfare and siege laid waste to the island. Political fragmentation and the collapse of military alliances prevented Mexica rulers from provisioning the island with food that had been supplied by tribute states. The destruction of the island's infrastructure, including the canals used to transport food and other goods, the dike that separated brackish waters from clean water, and the aqueduct that delivered drinking water to the city, created unlivable conditions in Mexico, Tenochtitlan, and Tlatelolco. The Mexica were devastated. Nahua authors of Book 12 of the Florentine Codex articulate memories of unprecedented suffering of the people due to famine and thirst. And all the common people suffered greatly. There was famine, many died of hunger. They no longer drank good, pure water, but the water they drank was salty. Many people died of it, and because of it, many got dysentery and died. They described how the starving Mexica were reduced to eating things that were unfit for human consumption. Everything was eaten: lizards, swallows, maize straw, grass that grows on salt flats. And they chewed at coloring wood, glue flowers, plaster, leather, and deerskin, which they roasted, baked, and toasted so that they could eat them. And they ground up medicinal herbs and adobe bricks. There had never been the like of such suffering. The siege was frightening, and great numbers died of hunger. And bit by bit, they came pressing us back against the wall, herding us together. So in the face of this incredible hardship, the Mexica and Tlatelolco really have little choice but to abandon the island. And in Book 12, of course, the Nahua authors remember this displacement. They recalled that, quote, following the Noche Triste, quote, when the Tenochca, who lived in Soquipan, saw this destruction, they fled in fear. The little children were taken along with the others. They just went into the water. The water was full of people, and a whale arose, and those with boats put their children in them and pulled them along, working vigorously. They took nothing at all with them. They just left all their poor property in fear. They just scattered everything in haste. And you can see here, there are literally people walking in the water, carrying their children on their backs. And then this is the folks in the canoes, right, who are paddling madly from one side, right, over to the other, where they're still going to encounter fierce fighting. Similarly, when the Mexico Tenochtitlan falls to the Spaniards, the authors capture both the sense of relief that the war had ended, as well as despair as a mass exodus from the island gets underway. Quote, "It's over, let everyone go eat greens," the people shout. The image and text show that people were so desperate to leave that many just went into the water rather than exit across the packed causeways. And here we can see an additional quote about how the people come streaming into Tlatelolco, right, trying to escape from the siege and the attack on the southern part of the island, and how in just one day they are forced to abandon their Altepet. So imagine this is Mexico Tenochtitlan has a population of 150,000, 200,000. There'd be literally tens of thousands of people dramatically trying to escape. And one final quote, "Little children were carried on people's backs. There was a general wail, some with rejoicing and amusing themselves as they went along the road. Most of the owners of boats left at night, though some left by day. They seemed to knock against one another as they went." So in just a matter of days, the Mexica and the Tlatelolco are forced to abandon their homes. In discussing each of the four themes, death, destruction, devastation, and displacement, the Nahua Florentine Codex authors, quote, "gave account of many things that happened among them during the war, things that those who conquered them did not know," unquote, to use Sahagún's words. They do not gloss over their collective suffering, and using the conventions of their verbal and visual language, they express the devastating consequences of the war. As Kevin has just pointed out, their account refuted the official Spanish narratives that asserted that Moctezuma had handed over the empire to Cortés and King, showing that it was through treachery, deceit, and brutality that the Spaniards gained control of the island. For the Nahuas, this was no just war, which was the legal and philosophical principle that the Spaniards used to justify their colonial empire, but rather an unjust war. Nahua intellectuals, with their close connections to the Franciscans, were surely aware of debates over the rights and status of indigenous peoples that were ongoing in Spain at this time. By challenging Spanish justifications for the conquest and the secondary status of indigenous peoples under colonial rule, the Nahua account of the war in the Florentine Codex becomes a subversive text that offers a counter-narrative to the official story. It is a testament to the resilience of the Nahua people. Thus, the Florentine Codex is not only a cultural product or an account of memories, but instead it is a history shaped by the time that it was written, when indigenous peoples and leaders returned to the island to quite literally rebuild their society, political structures, and economy in the wake of the arrival of strangers. Thanks.
Okay, we will take a 15-minute break, and you can go to the restroom downstairs or get a coffee. There should be still some breakfasty food items outside, and we will herd you back in when it's time to come back.